Following on from what Jeremy Griffith has said about the bushfires and the eucalypts, and my real concern, and we've seen it already, drought and bushfires have been forgotten. It's now coronavirus. Well, not for me. By the way, on that, we're an island continent, aren't we? How come you can't get on a plane with a nail file in your bag or over 100 mils of anything, but you can get on a plane and get into the country with a virus? There are a lot of things to us that don't make sense. For example, how does a plane stay in the sky and the Queen Mary sits on the water and man can walk on the moon and we can't put out a bushfire? Of course, it's all climate change. Rebecca Weisser, also writing in The Spectator a week ago, made the outstanding point, and I quote what she wrote: "If there were an Academy Award for the most histrionic response to Australia's bushfires, it would be hard to go past the French actress Isabelle Adjani, who refused to perform at this year's Sydney Festival because it would be an act of unspeakable indecency. Australia's bushfires were not a drama," she declared, "but a human, environmental and political tragedy brought on by its, quote, imperious, climate-sceptical, eco-irresponsible leaders." As Rebecca wrote, she couldn't even bring herself to shake hands with the director of the festival, who happens to be an Indigenous director, Wesley Enoch, and who knows more about bushfires than she ever will, unquote. Well, of course, as Rebecca wrote, the science is settled. Aren't we told that all the time? Science is not something that's meant to be settled. The process of inquiry is meant to go on, questioning. But coming to the point we've already made with Jeremy Griffith, Rebecca wrote this, quote, "Reducing eucalyptus fuel loads by removing their bark, leaves and branches from the forest floor reduces the ferocity of bushfires." But as Rebecca wrote, the champions of Indigenous reconciliation find it impossible to reconcile themselves to the fact that this requires regular burning, a practice engaged in by Aboriginals for millennia. I thought we should talk to Rebecca on this very same issue. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
What do you see? We've got it all wrong, haven't we?
Well, it's extraordinary. We seem to go through regular periods of amnesia where we forget what previous generations and the Aboriginal people for millennia, as I said, but the first settlers here, the pastoralists, the miners, all of them practice the same practices of clearing up the bushland.
Well, you quoted Bill Gammage, whose 2011 book was called The Biggest Estate on Earth, and it detailed how Aborigines used fire to shape the landscape, reduce bushfires and ensure continuity and abundance, and he was vilified and criticised.
Well, it was interesting. It was the Friends of the Earth who sort of wrote a book review about this, sort of saying that white Australia has a burning issue, you know, and criticised him for quoting the early explorers, giving the evidence of explorers like Thomas Mitchell, who talked about how they saw that these dense forests, it wasn't a case of dense forests, but open woodland. Yeah. Now, you don't just achieve that, as Gammage pointed out.
Well, you've got this outfit, Fire Sticks Alliance, whom I referred to earlier. It's an Indigenous-led community project, and that's exactly what they're saying, that cultural burning would help improve the government's fire and land management methods. As Oliver Costello said, he's criticised restrictions on access to land, the things that you were talking about, Graham, because burning is seen by these people, these know-alls, these bureaucratic know-alls, as a threat or something that will damage other people's interests.
Well, it's very interesting if you look at it, because even when the authorities go to try and burn, you get demonstrations, for examples from the Green. And there was an example of a demonstration at Nowa Nowa in Gippsland, in East Gippsland in Victoria, where the people were protesting against. They said, "Oh, don't do it in the spring because there's baby koalas." The same area devastated by bushfires.
The koalas are dead now.
Yeah.
Koalas are dead. Costello said, this Mr Costello, Indigenous knowledge of the land should be better utilised. Now, we have rejected all those practices.
It is bizarre. And I think what you find is that many people, Greens and environmentalists, will say, well, actually, I support burning. But then they put so many caveats on it that you can't practically actually do it. And then they say, oh, but we don't support grazing cattle in the alpine areas and so forth. Every step of the way, there's blocks.
But the common denominator here that you've alluded to and Jeremy alluded to is this question of eucalypts. Now, you have written And it's not just us. You've said, Rebecca Weisser, Australia has been exporting eucalypts around the world, and with them the bushfires, on which they thrive and which now regularly devastated places as far afield as California, Portugal, Spain and Greece. But of course then you also say, but the CFMEU and the forest industry have both called for fuel loads to be reduced in national parks through selective logging and hazard reduction burns. But you've got Scott Morrison of the National Press Club today being belted up because he's not doing anything about climate change, and all these bushfires are a manifestation of climate change. None of these things are even addressed.
It's extraordinary, and the answer is in front of us. As you've said, you can't have a fire without fuel. Look at the desert, say, of Saudi Arabia. No bushfires. You have to have something to burn. And the point about bushfires, about eucalypts, of course, is that they are full of the most volatile oil. So we have seen, for example, in Portugal and in Spain, they're starting to cut down the eucalyptus forests, say these are too dangerous, we don't want them. In certain areas where they put a lot of effort into it, and I think here we could look back to what Tony Abbott proposed, which was a green army, and that's really what you need. You need to, and Indigenous people would be great. What I would say, white Indigenous Australians, if they want to work in the country, absolutely, but this land needs to be cleared up every year or every second year, so it's a big task.
Great point that you made. No fires in Saudi Arabia, nothing to burn. See, you quote Joan Webster, the author of Essential Bushfire Safety Tips, who writes, tigers are native to India. Do Indians keep tigers in their garden? So why do Australians feel a compulsion, this is Joan Webster, to surround our houses with native plants ready for a sacrificial burn? But as I mentioned before, when John Stanhope, after the Canberra fire, said, look, we've got to stop all this, native plants, this is a risk, fire, well, he was demonised.
But he got it in by stealth. So he replanted that area with the Arboretum, which is full of deciduous trees and exotic trees, so that he could get that in. And I think, Alan, when you were talking before, what do we do? I think we need an oak zone and a eucalypt zone, and you should not live among these eucalypts, or not unless you're prepared to be one of these people who's going out and burning every second year and clearing it up. And that means this sort of smoky environment. It's not that great to breathe in, as we all discovered. We're inhaling all this. But it's got to be done, and otherwise I'd say...
There aren't many doing that.
But has the horse bolted, Rebecca? You see, look at them. Look at them. I mean, we're talking about millions of hectares of national parks in this country which are dominated... Those are all eucalypt trees. The trees are surviving all that, those pictures you're seeing. The trees, I call them silent sentinels to death and destruction. They're still there. After all of that, it's killed everything else.
But, we are making this mistake, I think, both sides of the political divide, both Bob Carr and, for example, now Gladys Berejiklian has recently just announced that they're going to put state forests and give them the conservation of national parks. Well, number one, they never give them, even if the national parks wanted to care for these areas properly, they never give them the resources. State forests, at least, generated an income by selective logging, and that paid then to maintain the fire trails and so forth. If we were collecting all of this fuel in Europe, that would count as renewable energy. That's biomass. But do you know what happens? Our friend John Pasquarelli told me he went to pick up some wood and he copped a fine. And that's what happens. People are fined just for picking up bark.
So you mentioned before national parks, Graham. There's no such thing. We call them national parks. There are no national parks. These things are meant to be managed by the states. And how many have we got? On last count, according, this is not me, according to the Commonwealth National Parks and the National Botanic Gardens and whatever, 5,331. America's got 61. 61. This is an inferno out there. And in those pictures you're seeing now, the only thing that's survived are the eucalypts. That's all that has survived.
We never, ever give enough money to those who were supposed to be managing this whole thing to do their job, do we?
That's right.
Well, hang on. We outsource that to bureaucrats and they start telling us there's 101 reasons why you can't do the sorts of things Rebecca's talking about. But shouldn't we reclassify these things? They're not national parks. Whose responsibility is it to clear this stuff? I mean, South Africa's got 29. Brazil's got 69. New Zealand, 14. India, massive India, 104. Even the China, 225. We've got 5,331. And when we say sort of reclassifying the land, what do you do in New South Wales? There's 7 million hectares of it.
Well, I think the point is that if you turn these things and start to recognise that there's economic potential, that we can actually harvest these trees, that we can make money out of it, as we used to do. Logging trees, oh, find a greenie who'll say they're in favour of that. Oh, no way, no way. But if you log them, you thin the forest out, so you reduce the fuel load on the forest floor, and it's a win-win.
That's the central thesis, isn't it? This is about fuel load. You can't have a fire without fuel. That's what it's about. It's not about the attacks on the government about what you're doing about climate change. This is absolute nonsense, and it's designed to detour people away from the reality. This is the reality. See, that's what Jeremy said tonight. Eucalypts are incinerators from hell dressed up as trees. And David Bowman says, what the hell have humans done? We've spread a dangerous plant all over the world, and fires lit by Aboriginal men and women created the landscape of Australia. They knew what to do. They knew what to do. So where do we go from here? I mean, this is a massive issue, while on the one hand the debate is dominated by climate change, and on the other hand the reality is the pictures we've seen here tonight.
Well, I think it's obvious what we have to do. I mean, the reality is that we have had dozens of royal commissions and inquiries, and they always come back and recommend that we have to reduce fuel loads, and then we ignore them. Even in Victoria, they were told how much. I think Professor David Bowman has sort of said even the amount that the Royal Commission had recommended wasn't enough. Then they did less than a third of what was recommended.
Well, you've said there since the see, that's why I think Scott Morrison, don't yield to these people. You don't need a Royal Commission. Rebecca has written since the 1939 Stretton Royal Commission into the Black Friday bushfires, there have been more than 16 major inquiries which have called for greater use of integrated approaches to land use planning and management to minimise disaster risks. What's happened? None of that's been, that's since 1939, none of that's been done, and indeed the targets have actually been reduced. And as you go to the South Coast, there they are, eucalypts, the incinerators from hell. But this is all over Australia, it's just that the fires actually caught the South Coast. It's all, what's burning in Victoria are eucalypts. What's burning in South Australia are eucalypts. What's burning in Queensland are eucalypts. What's burning in California and Portugal and Spain are eucalypts. When are we going to wake up and stop using this as an excuse to justify the climate change hoax?
No, we don't need to worry about evidence. The evidence has been in front of us for decades. It's everywhere. What we have to do is actually find the, if I'm not offending you, the balls to actually get out and do it. And it just seems to me that politicians...
It's very offensive language on a family program, really. Honestly.
Well, I'm sure you can handle it, you know. I mean...
Good little Christian boy brought up in a Catholic education. You come onto this program and use that sort of language. What's going on here?
Well,
apologise.
That's where I learned it.
That's right.
You misheard him, Alan. What he actually said was, golly gracious, great balls of fire. We need to do something.
Great balls of fire. Well, we do. It's good to talk to you, Rebecca.